This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It's January the 12th, 1979, and this is tape number 371, side A. I don't like to usually take up time on the tape for local news because by the time it reaches the east and around the country, these events are over. But there are too many people to contact personally to keep up with some of the things that are happening here in California that I will be doing and that I need your participation in. So the others just bear with me. And I do think it also pertains to work that you can do in your particular areas and following through with some of this research. I will be on Lynn Ryder's radio show, KXRX, in San Jose, Tuesday, January 23rd, from 7 to 10 p.m., a 3-hour talk show. That's important to mention because I did several shows with Lynn Ryder, and the evening of the second show, or just before that program, she was told that her talk show was being taken away. And this has happened other times where we've done shows that have been very successful, and I have come back 2 or 3 times, and the listeners were really catching on to the kind of news I was telling. The moderator was taken off the air. My programs were taken off with Carol Benson in Modesto and other stations where they were going very well. And because of listener participation and people that wrote the station manager and called Lynn and particularly contacted the station, I think it had some effect because Lynn called me very excited this week that her program is back on. She's got her talk show back again, and she wanted me to be the first guest on that show. And I think these letters did help, and I want to appreciate and thank those persons that wrote to her about having the talk show and having her back on and having this two-way communication. And it's important to listen to these shows and call in, and also those of you who have talk shows back east or the Larry King show, you can keep calling in and using this information and turning people on to the tapes and to the information and spread a lot of this around. That I don't feel that enough of you are doing that kind of thing, and it can be done very successfully. It doesn't take too many calls or letters to station managers to get a response. I did a 2-hour show at KPFA with Mom O'Shea up in Berkeley, and I'm going back up there to do a 2-hour radio show January 27th. That's Saturday afternoon from 3 to 5. That's a call-in, and again, they got many calls and letters, and the station manager at KPFA in Berkeley got letters. They wanted Mae Brussell back, and Mom O'Shea is on the board of directors there, and we're going to try and work out a monthly program with an update of news. Now, that show is taped and then sent to other KPFA stations around the country in Los Angeles, in Washington, and in New York, so that they're put on tape and distributed around the country, and it helps spread some of this information because there is such a terrible news blackout of many of the things that I talk about with you each week. And you can call in again on that program, and there may be many things that I won't have time to bring up that you might remind the listeners or have ideas of your own to inform them about these subjects. The Monterey Convention Center in town here on January the 27th, the evening of the 27th, is having a play. They're having a play called Kennedy Lives, and it will be touring around the country, and the actor has studied John Kennedy's speeches for the last 13 years. They're going to be taking a videotape of that play to play over in Europe, and as I say, he'll be touring around the country with this, and I will be awarding students. They're having a contest for students before the play, the week before, on what John Kennedy meant to America or meant to them. Many of these students, of course, were babies when John Kennedy was assassinated, but he's relegated to history like President Truman or President Roosevelt or Abraham Lincoln. And they're writing essays, and I will be there in the evening of the 27th, hurry down from Berkeley and do that presentation. And also, KGO is a station that has blacklisted a lot of my material, the daytime shows. Bob Trevor is pretty loyal. I was on the program. I called him up last night about some material, and I will be on there February the 3rd, that Saturday, from 10 to 12 p.m. So that's 3 talk shows for the people in the California area, and the Bob Trevor, of course, goes up to Seattle and Oregon. For those of you that have the tapes up there, and in Vancouver, you can listen to it in the evening. You get the tapes up there, and you can disseminate this information if people want to hear these shows. You can call in and ask questions, and then afterwards, it's important to write to the managers of KGO and KPFA and KXRX, and I'll give you their addresses, and tell them that you appreciate this kind of information going over AM and FM radio stations, both of them, and that they continue to do that. These people are good sources of getting the material out. They're interested, they're alive, they're into the subjects, and we have to encourage them and thank them for using the airwaves, and of course keep using that media to reach as many people as we can, as often as we can. And of course that's why it takes your support. And then again, in the East, those of you that take the tapes have notified other radio stations who've called me for interviews, and we get more information out through these radio talk shows. Sometimes they're 2 and 3 hours at a time, coming from New York, Boston, Miami, Atlanta, Georgia. I'm doing a lot of radio shows, and a lot of it is caused by people taking the tapes and calling these various people and asking for Mae Brussell to be on and sending them samples of the tapes. So let's keep that up and keep spreading the information and getting it out to more states and more people while we still can. Just speaking about one person's letter or 2 people writing a letter, getting a woman her program back. I have an example here on June 30th, 1978, on our tape 322, side 1. I mentioned that a radio station in Monterey, California, was sold to a man named James E. Brown, who has what he calls a Christian Awareness Broadcasting System. And he bought a station here called K-Wave, K-W-A-V. And the Monterey Herald had an article that he would exclude all Jews from airtime, that the radio station was only supposed to be used for Christians, and no Jews could use his radio station. And one single man in this community, a Mr. Sherman, who owned a music store called the Record Cove, headed a committee and got a few other people behind him and was very instrumental in stopping the sale of that radio station. And Mr. James Brown has backed out from buying K-Wave, and it's now in the hands of the original owners, and it will not be a Christian radio station. And that is the way to fight these things as they come up one by one, and don't wait for somebody else to do it. Mr. Sherman didn't wait. He had no support from the local rabbi, from the Jewish community at large. They sat back. But as an individual, he fought that, and just this last week it was announced that the Christian station would not be bought. And again, this is the effort of a single person. There's some of you writing letters to the editor, calling the talk shows. Some of you are just taking the tapes and listening and putting them on your shelves. The best thing to do, if you really care, is to extend yourself and write letters to the stations, write letters to the editor, call the talk shows, send copies of tapes to your friends. There's no copyright on them, and keep the information going and fight for what you believe in, like Mr. Sherman did here at K-Wave. United Press International had an article January the 10th, 1979. Fort Worth, Texas, a British lawyer and author, Michael Eddowes, filed a petition in Tarrant County District Court in Texas, Court 141, to exhume the body of Lee Harvey Oswald that is buried in Fort Worth's Rose Hill Cemetery. Michael Eddowes wrote a book, 2 books on the John Kennedy assassination, and he alleges that the person that came back to the United States was a Russian agent, that it was not Lee Harvey Oswald, the one that was in the Marines who went to the Soviet Union, that there was a look-alike that was substituted in Oswald's place. He's named as respondents in the petition Tarrant County District Attorney Tim Curry and County Medical Examiner Felix Guotz. I suppose that's the way you pronounce it. I'll give you the spelling in the sheet that accompanies this tape. The petition will be heard in Tarrant County District Court 141. It will not appear on the docket before April. Therefore, we have time in the months of February and March to pursue this, to write to public officials and ask that that body be exhumed. Michael Eddowes has a different reason than I have for exhuming the body of Lee Harvey Oswald. I want to know if that is in fact the double Lee Harvey Oswald, and if Oswald was substituted after the interview with Jack Ruby in the press. It was early Saturday morning, late Friday night, the week of November 22nd, 23rd, 1963. Those of you who have my earlier tape number 341, July 28th, 1978, side 2, I talked about the necessity to exhume the body of Lee Harvey Oswald and how I knew the House Select Committee would ignore this kind of important evidence, and gave you on that sheet, if you have it accompanying the tapes, the minutes of the meeting of the Warren Commission in January 1964. The various members were meeting and ordered the cremation of the body that was supposed to be Lee Harvey Oswald. It was Chief Justice Earl Warren, as I put on the sheet, who said it has been suggested that they exhume him and cremate him. The question might arise before this thing, and he doesn't say what that thing was. As to something on that body, I don't know what it is. It might be the course of the bullet, and it might be something else. And, of course, I wanted this body exhumed. I've wanted it exhumed ever since I had the minutes of the Warren Commission meetings, which David Lifton had published. Very important to have the book, the document addendum to the Warren Report, and also to dig up this body. In July of '78, the CIA planted a story that they tried to have the body exhumed, that there was going to be some speculation about exhuming the body of Lee Harvey Oswald, but that the CIA tried to have it exhumed, and then it was stopped. That is not true, and I said that was a planted story, that the CIA attorneys have suppressed all information about the fact that there were orders to cremate this body and destroy it, even before the Warren Commission called their first witness. They had 552 witnesses, and before a single witness was called to find out who killed John Kennedy or why Jack Ruby killed Lee Harvey Oswald, they were going to destroy the body of Lee Harvey Oswald. I did talk about that in July of this year, in July 28, 1978. So we must follow up on the efforts. This is a story now about a filing of an attorney to bring up that body and see if it is in fact Lee Harvey Oswald, and see who is in that coffin. That's important for me, for my work, because if that is not Lee Harvey Oswald, then I know where he went and how he got out of Texas and the route that he went away. And then also it would it would be mandatory then to go a little farther over to Houston, Texas, where there's an unmarked grave under acres of grass, and pull out that body that's supposed to be Howard Hughes, and you'll find out that it's Vance Cooper. And then we'll really know who's running the government and who's pulling the wool over our eyes. Jack Anderson, of course, ignored the entire House Select Committee for 2 years, but when the report came in, he had an article this week called Final Report, in which he says the House Assassination Committee will conclude that organized crime had the motive, means, and opportunity to kill President Kennedy. I talked about that last week, that you got the diagram. That's where the committee and the critics leave off from point 5 down, blame the anti-Castro Cubans, and break organized crime. Not break it, but cut your losses at dead members of organized crime such as Sam Giancana and John Rosselli. Jack Anderson had said that the committee investigators found no evidence of a top-level mob plan to kill Kennedy, but the fact that Jack Ruby executed Lee Harvey Oswald is a standard way of silencing a man who would talk. That's Jack Anderson as of January the 7th, 1978. He says there's possible links the committee have found of Lee Harvey Oswald and Jack Ruby to organized crime, and as I've stressed before, on that scale it goes much, much higher, and Jack Anderson comes in to wipe up the loose ends and reiterate the possible mob killing of by Jack Ruby of Lee Harvey Oswald. Of course, if it's that low-level organized crime wiping out of Lee Harvey Oswald the way the syndicate and mob does, he still can't explain, Jack Anderson, then why the Dallas Police Department would hide members of organized crime and be the subject of books and criticisms and investigations, or why the Dallas Police Department would take suspects photographed leaving Dealey Plaza and never list them or book them or fingerprint them, or why Earl Warren and Alan Dulles and John J. McCloy would cover up for such characters of Anderson names such as Angelo Bruno from Philadelphia, or Santos Trafficano, or Carlos Marcella. Why would the Warren Commission lock up for 75 years information about Ruth and Michael Payne and Oswald's connections to the U-2 flight? Why would they lock up the Nazi connections to the assassination? Why would they destroy Kennedy's car or his brains or John Connolly's clothing and lampposts and street signs and so forth? Would the Warren Commission and the Dallas Police and the FBI do all that for Angelo Bruno and Carlos Marcello, who had been deported once already, or Santos Trafficano? They can kill these men so fast. Why would they do all that to cover up for organized crime? And why would Henry Luce buy up the Abraham Zapruder frames and lock them up, rearrange the sequence, alter the pictures, paint in a scope, and then erase the scope? That's the same Henry Luce who lauded Adolf Hitler and Mussolini, who put them on the cover of his magazines over and over again as the great saviors of the world. Why would he cover organized crime? And why would the State Department give Lee Harvey Oswald a passport within 24 hours in the summer of '63 after he already had defected to the Soviet Union, told them he was giving them radar secrets of our Marines in the Pacific Ocean, and give away codes and information, and then the State Department sent him money to come home? Why would they do all that? I think that the simplistic attitude of people like Jack Anderson is so dangerous because it doesn't cover the areas. Why would Robert Mayu of the Howard Hughes organization, who worked with the CIA and the FBI, team up in 1960, just the time that John Kennedy got the nomination to become president? Why would he team up with organized crime and make that marriage be the person who blends together the very people that are suspect in this case now? How can Anderson leave Hughes out? Howard Hughes in 1962 said, in quotes, "The Kennedy brothers are a relentless thorn in my side," and Robert Mayhew was working with Howard Hughes through this period up through 1966, through the assassination period of John Kennedy, and certainly setting this framework for Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy. And why would they leave out the connections of Clay Shaw from the International Trade Mart in New Orleans with these same mob kings, Carlos Marcello and David Ferry? Clay Shaw knew these people. Why is it that Jack Anderson wants to pin this on the mob? The answer, of course, is that is the level of cover-up, what I gave you last week, up to number 5. And then Nicholas Hark of the New York Times, the same newspaper that published the Warren Report, the paperback edition, he had a little article, quite a large article, tracing any Kennedy connections, or is tracing any Kennedy conspirator is given little chance by officials. This is the New York Times. He says the chance of identifying and prosecuting any conspirators in the murder of President Kennedy 15 years ago appears remote. Why is it so remote? Gerald Ford was on the Warren Commission. Gerald Ford presented that phony, planted, forged Lee Harvey Oswald diary and leaked it to Life magazine. He wrote a book based on false information and lies about Lee Harvey Oswald. He knew, and I have the exact documents to prove, that Lee Harvey Oswald worked for both the FBI and the CIA. A crime of cover-up is also part of the charge of conspiracy. Why does Herrick say that you can't identify or prosecute conspirators? Richard Nixon had to lose the presidency, which is the highest office in his land, or one of the highest, I suppose, because of cover-up. Why does Gerald Ford become president, and why does he want to be a candidate again? Call in Marina Oswald and ask her about that planted rifle we talked about last week, or perjury about the reception of the rifle, or forging the name of Lee Harvey Oswald. I think perjury is still a crime, and forging is a crime, and if Lee Harvey Oswald didn't order that rifle, and if she wrote the name, I think she could be called. He went on to say the committee refused to rule out that individuals in the anti-Castro group or individual criminals had done the killing. This is Nicholas Hurok in the New York Times saying the committee refused to rule out that individuals from crime or individual criminals of the anti-Castro ilk had done the killing. They didn't rule out individuals. That's true. They left that open. The report will say individuals. But what about the connecting links of Robert Mayu? He made those connections of the mob to the anti-Castro Cubans. What about E. Howard Hunt and Frank Sturgis? Hunt had offices with Buckley and the CIA in Mexico that were a source of funding of Watergate and assassination teams. And again, the forged diary of Lee Harvey Oswald that Gerald Ford leaked to Life magazine. Did E. Howard Hunt write it? He could be prosecuted. Why was Richard Nixon going to give him this money at the time of Watergate? What was so important? And what about the assassination plans that Frank Sturgis could be a part of with the anti-Castro Cubans? There was definitely a conspiracy plan to kill John Kennedy in Miami. Why not call in these people? You see, the New York Times is saying that individuals were involved and that the House Select Committee has singled out possible individuals without connections higher up that you can't find or prosecute any longer anyone involved. I don't agree at all. Nicholas Katzenbach, the attorney for IBM, was called before the House Select Committee. He was a deputy attorney general in '64. He was the man they selected to order the cremation of the body of Lee Harvey Oswald. If we dig up that body and we find out that Nicholas Katzenbach was responsible for ordering it to be cremated, just taking orders like a good German, I suppose, but even then, it doesn't mean that we can't prosecute these people just because they weren't holding the gun isn't important. These are still crimes. This is a crime of cover-up to order the cremation of a man and possibly bury his double. And then they could call in the executives from Ford Motor Company and also from either the Secret Service or the FBI or the Pentagon, because the question is, who ordered the car to go to Michigan? We still don't know whether the Secret Service sent it there, whether Army intelligence sent it there, or the FBI. But a man has a name. A man has to have a name and a document at 48 hours after Kennedy was killed that the car was shipped away without being examined for a murder. Now, we can find out who that man is. These are things the House Select Committee didn't do, but as long as they're coming up with an assassination conspiracy that involves organized crime and the anti-Castro Cubans, you can't separate those individuals from the Gehlen operation, Hitler's Eastern intelligence, a Nazi intelligence, or American intelligence. Therefore, you go one step further. Now that we know they were involved, how did they get involved, and who allowed the evidence to be destroyed? We can go to the National Archives, and the House Select Committee didn't ask how the JFK brains disappeared. There must be a chain of command. You just can't go to the archives and ask for a bottle of brains and get rid of them. Somebody ordered the car, somebody ordered the brains to be disappeared, and then get the name of the agent who went to the home of Representative Henry Gonzalez in Washington, D.C., and picked up some paper bags with clothing, John Connolly's shirt and his trousers and his coat. That agent from the Secret Service, he has a name, John Doe or Mr. ABC or whatever. Give him any name, like the alphabet bomber in L.A. I mean, just the man has to have a name. He was sent to the home apartment of a congressman from Texas living in Washington, D.C., and went to a dry cleaner. Was it a CIA dry cleaner? Was it an FBI dry cleaner or the Secret Service or his own? But he has to have a name. He checked in. He just picked it up, took it, because the clothing were returned to the FBI, only dry cleaned. Now, they have to know who turned them in. When you get evidence like that, there's a name attached to it, and that would show entry or exit bullets. And it's time we find out who picked up the clothing and who had it dry cleaned and who delivered it. You see, Nicholas Hurok in the New York Times can say we'll never know these things, but we will know them because these people are alive. It may be 15 years later, but they're all alive. Then go to Mullen Associates, the public relations firm that has been a front for the Howard Hughes organization, the killer team, and for E. Howard Hunt and the Buckley Combine with their connections to Douglas Caddy. And they had a CIA front called the Free Cuban Committee down in New Orleans that was funded by the Defense Department and the CIA. And one of the people, the financial supporters of the committee, was a man named Mr. William Riley. And Riley Coffee Company is where Lee Harvey Oswald picked up his money while he was in New Orleans working with Mr. Bannister, Guy Bannister, and David Ferry and Clay Shaw, all of the CIA and FBI. And his paycheck came from Mr. William Riley, even though he didn't go to the coffee company in the daytime at all, but it was a conduit of money. Mr. William Riley, for all I know, isn't dead. It may be 15 years later, but find out about his Free Cuban Committee. And his connections were very strong to Sergio Acacia Smith and David Ferry and Gordon Novell. Now, Ferry's dead, but Smith is alive, and Novell is alive, and Novell was even considered as a director of the CIA not too long ago. He was an important man with the CIA continuously. So the story that it's 15 years later and it's remote that there can be prosecutions is just ridiculous. We could call in these people and get a little testimony out of them. He said, Nicholas Horrocks said, many of the key people are dead or have disappeared. There are many of them alive, and just as I listed for you on a tape a while back, all the important witnesses that had been murdered since the assassination of John Kennedy, perhaps we should do one cassette one day on all the witnesses who are alive, who could be prosecuted and counted for, just like the Watergate people went to jail, some of them, John Ehrlichman and John Robert Haldeman and Charles Colson. There are a bunch of them. Donald Segretti, they went to John Mitchell, the golf-playing country club jails, but they went to jail. And some of them did lose their law degree and lost some of their respectability. And they were all part of the crime of cover-up. They were never charged with killing J. Edgar Hoover or Mary Jo Kopechne or Robert Kennedy or shooting George Wallace or planning riots that could have killed people in Miami or even planning to kill Richard Nixon in 1972. They all went to jail for cover-up, the crime of cover-up. So the idea that you can't prosecute these people because it's 15 years later is just a lot of bull. Now, you remember I think it was a Senator Church Committee. It came out that 400 persons from the news media were involved with the Central Intelligence Agency, and we've never been able to get the names of these people, but you get a pretty good idea out of the junky columns they put out. One just came out yesterday by James Kilpatrick. It's about the House Select Committee, called $5 Million Badly Spent. And he said it seems impossible for anybody to convert the dramatic event of the 20th century, the killing of John Kennedy, into an exercise in boredom. But the House Select Committee did it, and he's got a cartoon in his article of a little garbage can, and there's a dollar sign, and bags of money are being thrown in the garbage can, and he said it was clear then, it is clear now. Lee Harvey Oswald killed the president, and 2 years of labor have produced one positive conclusion: the Secret Service, the FBI, the CIA were not involved in the assassination of John Kennedy. It would be nice to show Jack Anderson and Nicholas Horrocks and James Kilpatrick and the 400 other lying bastard CIA news people that are planted all over the country that they're wrong. And one way to do it is to support Michael Eddowes' plan to exhume that body and find out if that was not Lee Harvey Oswald, then every single one of these reporters should also be prosecuted for cover-up, because we can trace their links to the Central Intelligence Agency. They are part of disinformation. They're part of continuous cover-up of getting columns syndicated all over the United States in every newspaper with their rotten talk and lies and cartoons. And I think there is much a part of the problem. If the CIA was involved in covering up the assassination of John Kennedy or in getting Lee Harvey Oswald out of the country, if there was a double, and if the CIA has 400 newsmen that are writing this kind of garbage, then the newsmen should be accountable, and the list should be given of those people so we know who we're reading and why they're writing this kind of trash all the time. Our last comments on the JFK investigation for this week come from the Washington Post, January the 3rd, this past week. It says the Justice Department will not act on finding on JFK findings for now. Translated for now probably means forever. It said the Justice Department indicated yesterday it will take no immediate action into investigating any further the murder of John Kennedy. Of course, this is written by George Lardner, Jr., who's a continuous cover-up bastard, too. He says in his article that in Gainesville, Florida, a former counsel for the House committee, Kenneth Bruton, suggests that medical evidence might support the conspiracy theory. He said Kennedy's autopsy showed a hematoma or blood clot in the upper back beneath the shoulder blade, and he was quoted by the UPI as saying the cause of the clot was never revealed. What if the clot happens to be a bullet, and that's why we can't ever see the autopsy x-rays, but we can only see drawings of it because, for one thing, the original FBI autopsy said a bullet went in the back finger length and didn't go through the throat or chest. And that's why it's important to find out about the clothing of John Connolly and the car that was destroyed, that ripped out the seats but was never examined properly, the metal part in Michigan, and all that other evidence that is missing that would show more than one assassin, because this is not a mafia hit team. This is a cover-up from the Pentagon, as I say, from the historian on down, the highest level of conspiracy. And the Justice Department doesn't want to touch it or go into it, but now we find out that there was a blood clot somewhere in a shoulder blade, and goodness knows what else there is. Every day a little more leaks out, and he's suggesting that this part of the shoulder blade had never been revealed. On the other side of this tape now, we'll go into Jonestown some more. Mae Brussell, and this is side 2, 371, tape number 371B, side 2, January the 12th, 1979. There was an important story that came over the news this past week that I want to share with you, and also use it as an example of how selective the news is around the country. I keep reiterating that, and we'll illustrate that over and over for you, because there are many young people taking these tapes who may go into political science, into law, into research, or who are doing it now. Thinking people, and also older people too. This isn't just for the younger ones. This is for people to recognize how the media is distracted or separated, and how important it is, if you want to know something about a subject, besides the superficial, how important it is to get as much information on that particular subject that there is. It doesn't matter what specialty you're in or what it is you select that you want to know. But if you want to know it well, you have to take it from many, many sources. I'm referring now to an article that was in the Washington Post this last week, dated January the 6th, and it also was in our Monterey Herald. It wasn't in the San Francisco Chronicle, and it wasn't in the Los Angeles Times, and I haven't gotten my Eastern papers from the 6th yet, but it's given credit to the Washington Post service, not Associated Press, United Press, or Reuters. The title of the article is Ex-Agent Turned Author Investigated. FBI papers found in the People's Temple ruins. And this goes on to say that sensitive FBI documents, they were taken from Chicago, that are the makings of a book. An FBI agent is writing a book about illegal FBI activities. And the working papers that he had for this book were found down in Guyana in the ruins of the People's Temple in Jonestown. It says the bizarre discovery has triggered an investigation of this former FBI agent who has turned author, and it says he's been cooperating with the Church of Scientology. It also led to an exchange of accusations between Charles Gary and Mark Lane. Charles Gary said the FBI went into his office a few weeks ago to get other copies of this FBI material. Sensitive FBI documents were in the offices of Charles Gary. The matter is considered serious because informants can be identified from some of the documents. One informant has already received a death threat as a result. These are working papers of the FBI using the names of their informants that were on the documents, and one of them received a death threat. Possible charges against this former agent for stealing the government documents will be barred. It may be barred because of an understanding given by the Justice Department that he would be immune from prosecution. Now, what I'm saying here and reading and translating is the article saying that FBI man formerly from Chicago had documents of the FBI with the names of FBI agents on them. They originally came from the office of Charles Gary, and they were found down in Jonestown in Guyana, and that the FBI agent, the former agent who stole them, may not be prosecuted for stealing them, which means he probably is an infiltrator who's working with them and exposing from the inside out because he's immune from prosecution. It said the former agent asked not to be identified, said that the material for his book that he's writing was found 3 weeks ago when 6 FBI men from Los Angeles arrived with a search warrant, and they found these down in Jonestown. They traced them to Charles Gary's office. Charles Gary and Mark Lane have divergent versions of how the former FBI man's material got down to Jonestown. Charles Gary had given a key to his office to Terri Buford, and he claims that she went in and copied the documents and took them down there. Mark Lane says that he had them and knew about them. An assistant of Charles Gary said that Terri Buford knew the agent's proposed book and had been introduced to him at Charles Gary's office a year ago. Terri Buford met this agent, and the article from the Washington Post and the Monterey Herald did not identify the agent by name. But the San Jose Mercury, with a byline from the New York Times, the same date, on the same subject, mentions the FBI man by name. And the thing that's so interesting to me is that he turns out to be Mr. M. Wesley Swearingen, the FBI agent who was working for Larry Flynt and Mark Lane, who was at the press conference when Lane put a $1 million ad from Larry Flynt that I mentioned last week into the newspapers, 42 newspapers around the country, and said, "You bring to me your information on John Kennedy and Martin Luther King, and we'll give you a $1 million reward." And I mentioned before how dangerous it would be to turn this material over to Lane because these witnesses could be killed. And here he was working with Mr. Wes Swearingen of the FBI, and people innocently enough could turn this over. And it seems that already one agent has had a death threat whose name is on this list, who fears that because these documents have been taken away, that his life is in danger. The New York Times story goes on to say that a source reported having seen these papers said they included confidential reports to the Attorney General Griffin Bell of alleged FBI operations conducted out of the Chicago office. It said the memorandums and illegal papers had been prepared by M. Wesley Swearingen, a career FBI agent who retired it said in May of last year. But if he retired in May of last year, I did a tape, number 310, February 26, 1978, and he was working for Larry Flynt and Mark Lane at the time that he was still in the Federal Bureau of Investigations. If the New York Times is right that he retired in May, he was still working for the FBI when Larry Flynt was putting ads in the LA Free Press, the New York Times, and all over the United States for people to give them information of who killed John Kennedy and Martin Luther King. The San Jose Mercury story with the byline of New York Times said Wes Swearingen worked in the Chicago Bureau office until 1971. That's the period where Charlie Bates worked in there. He also worked for the Watergate investigation, the FBI. Charles Bates was head of the FBI. It must have been the chief over West Swearingen in Chicago at the time of the Fred Hampton, Mark Clark killings. And we know later it was in 72, the Dorothy Hunt plane crash in the summer of 72, after the Watergate story broke. Or rather, Dorothy Hunt's plane crash was in 73. West Swearingen worked in the Chicago offices of the FBI with Charles Bates, who then came to California to head the FBI bureau at the time of the Patty Hearst kidnapping. And West Swearingen went down to Los Angeles with the FBI, and that's where the FBI was working with criminal conspiracy section of the Los Angeles Police Department. This article says he was transferred to Los Angeles Division in 1971. Several months ago, a source said, Swearingen made contact with Charles Gary, a longtime lawyer for radical causes. It had to be more than several months ago, because we're talking now about January 79, and Charles Gary's best friend, Don Freed, was arranging the press conference down in Los Angeles in 1st of February of 78, a year ago. So that Mark Lane and Charles Gary and West Swearingen could gather material from people, use it for their own books to make a buck, get involved in these ghastly murders and this multinational, international financial setup known as Jonestown. The New York Times article said one government source said Friday that if the FBI documents found at Jonestown proved to match the original classified versions, those individuals responsible for removing them from the Bureau files and copying them and transporting them might be subject to federal prosecution. Well, is that Mark Lane? Is that Terri Buford? Is that Charles Gary? Because the other article says that the agent himself, Wesley Swearingen, would be immune from prosecution. So there's a tanglement here that I hope is clear to you. The points I want to make in this are that earlier in my tapes talking about the press conference in Los Angeles, and after that press conference I had lunch. I was at that press conference where Swearingen was presented, and it was my son Marvin, I have a tape recording of the conference, asked, how can we trust you from the FBI working with Mark Lane now? The FBI wasn't so clean in the assassinations. He asked that question, and Mark Lane said, well, you have to give them credit for having seen the light and changing the course of their actions. Well, that was early in the year. That was in the first of the year of 1977, and West Swearingen, according to this, didn't even retire until May. So Marvin's question was very accurate, and he, in fact, still was working for the FBI and working with Mark Lane and Jim Jones and getting documents. And also, worse than that, West Swearingen was working side by side with Mark Lane so that any person who wanted a buck, who had information, thought he could collect that $1 million reward, was to turn it over to Mark Lane and West Swearingen of the FBI and maybe dangle a reward. And I said before, why didn't they go to the House Select Committee? If they wanted to solve the problem, they should have put a $1 million ad in and said, turn it over to Mr. Webster of the FBI or the Justice Department or the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and if there's a prosecution, we'll give you the reward. Turn it over to the legal authorities, because the House Select Committee had subpoena power, they had a $6 million budget, and yet a branch of the FBI was out in California. Mark Lane wasn't in Washington while the House Select Committee was working. He was working with a branch of the FBI in the offices of Larry Flint, and he could be a vacuum cleaner to suck up information. And as I say, as a result of these documents, one person has already received a death threat, and we don't know if anybody else has died. Right after that press conference, I had lunch with Lillian Castellano, who did this fantastic work on the Robert Kennedy assassination. I described that in my February 19th tape, 1978, how we had lunch together after the press conference, and the next week later, Lillian was found dead, and the LAPD had come in and gone through her material and files in her home after she was found dead. For some of you, it might be confusing that I go back and keep referring to past tapes, but that's the importance of this work in the past 15 years, is the continuity of the work, and I don't have transcribed tapes ready for duplication of the past 8 years on KLRB, 7 years, but since March of 77, the tapes are available, and because you can order those or have them already, you'll have to bear with us while I refer to the past tapes and just look up that material yourself so that I don't have to repeat that information. It may sound vague because there's new people getting tapes every week and starting to subscribe, but the best I can tell you is get the past tapes and look it up and follow it in that way. Terri Buford, that lovely defector from the Jim Jones Temple, who said that she suspected that things were mildly wrong and that Jim Jones was crazy and the commune down there was miserable, even though she said it was obvious it was miserable and they'd have to move. It was too hard and too rough. And she said this at a time that Mark Lane was on the press being paid $10,000 to tell you it was a virtual paradise, along with Charles Gary. I certainly think these men should go to court and account for the variances of opinions and how they're paid to sell something. You see, that's what public relations is, and that's what propaganda is. That the media is used, the mass media is used to tell you something 180 degrees different than what it really is. Terri Buford had an article, there's an article about her in the New York Times I didn't have time to quote last week. She talked about the temple activities and the establishment of a hit list of people that were to be killed, and she refers to Timothy O. Stone, the legal advisor for the temple, as the man who masterminded this. And, of course, that goes back to Stanford research, and he was a lawyer from Stanford University who set up Jim Jones' first California operation in Ukiah after he had his brainwashing and treatment down in Brazil with the CIA from 1962 to 63, and a visit to Guyana, and then back to Ukiah, and then out to back to Indiana, and then back to Ukiah to meet Tim Stone, who was the next control of Jim Jones. Terri Buford said Mr. Jones ordered her to drug one of their temple members by the name of Sandy Bradshaw, who lived in San Francisco, and she said Mr. Jones didn't want to continue having an affair with Miss Bradshaw, but he wanted her to get drugs in California that would develop, in quotes, symptoms before she comes to Guyana so that she would not become suspicious that she was being poisoned. Jim Jones used to brag about the length of his penis and his sexual feats, but I think it's pretty hard to have sex from Guyana with a woman who lives in San Francisco, no matter how great he was. And the reason he wanted her drugged, according to this story, all cover story, he didn't want to continue an affair with her. Why does he have to have an affair with her? He has a wife and 3 mistresses down in Jonestown, plus all the men and women he wants. But the important thing about the story is that she was to develop symptoms before she got to Guyana so that the people down there, and that she wouldn't be suspicious that she was being poisoned. Now, what kind of poison was she to receive, or what kind of poison did the others receive, and why were they killing Sandy Bradshaw, sending her from San Francisco to Guyana to kill her, while all the other people around this Jonestown that set up this operation are alive and may be rich someday? She said, Terri Buford, that Mr. Stone goaded Jim Jones into destroying himself and the People's Temple. Did you read the article this week that came out, a new document that the CIA used electroshock, turned people into vegetables, used 2 kinds of shock, one the normal shock treatment for convulsions and amnesia, and another one that would cause convulsions and guarantee that the amnesia would erase any knowledge of the use of convulsive shock. It caused excruciating pain, and they began that in 1951 and could erase the memory that they even had the shock. That's the kind of things the CIA was in, and I think that Jim Jones in Brazil could have been given any kind of mind control treatment while he was working with the CIA, because he could be signaled to destroy himself telephonically, as I referred to the Candy Jones book, and so forth. And Tim Stone was the one who kept goading him on, and of course the cover story was the story of that son that they both seem to have fathered, and incidentally the son hasn't been reported among the dead. and could have been taken out on a boat by Mr. Blakey and is alive and in the Barbados or somewhere. Grace Stone and Tim Stone haven't said anything, and the excuse for killing these 11 people was over this particular son that I don't even think died. Terri Buford said in the New York Times that Mr. Stone set up a diversion department whose mission was to manufacture floods of mail, telephone calls, and that he committed crimes. He had election fraud in San Francisco. He used the district attorney's office in San Francisco as assistant DA to protect the temple members and keep them in line, and that he smuggled money out of the country. Keep in mind that the prosecutor for a possible conspiracy for gun running, for drugs, for money being taken out of the country, for the murder of Congressman Ryan, for the murder of 912 people, for shipping children from juvenile halls down to be murdered, the man that would be prosecuting that in San Francisco is a Mr. Hunter who shared a house with Tim Stone, kept his property there, was affiliated with members of the People's Temple, and he's supposed to be the prosecutor and hasn't even been removed in San Francisco from this particular case. Terri Buford went on to say that they signed confessions to various crimes, and I had noted that in my tapes in the summer of '77. She said Jim Jones was a maniac, and at the same time, I think he was manipulated into that. And that, of course, fits the same description of Adolf Hitler, a maniac with a terrific ego who himself accumulated nothing, really, no wealth or property, and could be manipulated into that. Terri Buford said that their intention was to go to the Soviet Union, where they have freedom of movement and freedom of speech, and that's pretty funny. And she said Jim Jones would have had freedom. I doubt if he would have had freedom or the fun of using his $26 million that he accumulated if he'd gone to the Soviet Union. Another important article in the paper this week is Herb Caen, just a small article, January the 11th, that Jerry Brown wants to name Carlton Goodlett, the doctor, the San Francisco black newspaper publisher, to the University of California Board of Regents. He's been trying to get him on the Board of Regents. You have to read some of the material of the Labor Caucus on Jerry Brown and his links to Ken Casey and the drug cult, and to Stuart Brandt, who I've always called a Nazi, who's from Stanford Research, who got out the Whole Earth Catalog, that's an advisor to Jerry Brown. Jerry Brown, according to Herb Caen, wants to get Carlton Goodlett, the newspaper publisher. Now, Herb Caen calls him a newspaper publisher in the San Francisco Chronicle, yet Carlton Goodlett was the doctor for Jim Jones, the doctor for the people that went down there, the man who prescribed the drugs for the temple, who has not said, at least that I know of the grand jury, how those drugs got down there. They did get down there from nurses and doctors, and he had almost all of his patients, those black people, those black mammies, that entourage of several hundred black people that were shipped down to be killed, were patients of Dr. Carlton Goodlett, and I will share for you on these tapes part of a radio show he had on KGO, which I tape recorded, and I have to type up. But he's a doctor, and he prescribed medicine for these people and drugs and misdiagnosed, gave diagnosis of Jim Jones without putting him in a hospital or in an office. And even the newspaper covers up that he was a doctor who prescribed for these people, who gave them their drugs, and was down at Jonestown and was part of the support team of Charles Gary praising Jim Jones, and praises him today as a great operation, a Schweitzer clinic, an eye-opener for the world. You should hear him talk about that Jonestown. And yet, here we have a woman that is going to be drugged, the Sandy Bradshaw, who's to be sent down there and be given symptoms before she arrives because she's going to be poisoned. And I wonder if Dr. Carlton Goodlett gave that medicine to Terri Buford or to this Miss Bradshaw, and he's to be on the Board of Regents of California. When I read that, I almost wish Catherine Hearst was back on the Board of Regents. I have a button collection. I have one button, where is Oswald now that we need him? After Lee Harvey Oswald was killed and Lyndon Johnson was president, there was a button that came out. You probably remember that. And then when Nixon was president, there was a button that came out, where is Lee Harvey Oswald now that we really need him? Of course, Oswald wasn't the assassin, and therefore I didn't really like the button that much. but I think I have to get a button made now, whereas Catherine Hearst, now that we need her, goodness knows if we're going to have Carlton Goodlett on the Board of Regents in Berkeley, California, the home of the SLA, these various drug kings that have been passing out drugs to the students and part of this espionage system of California. Can you imagine what it would be like to have a man like Carlton Goodlett as a Board of Regents appointed by Jerry Brown to the University of California? And all of this hogwash about People's Temple being a Soviet socialist enterprise is so ridiculous. This Terri Buford says in the article that maybe she didn't fit in because she wasn't like the other temple members, that she still might have been a capitalist, that she wasn't enough of a socialist when she left. After depositing all this money, it would almost turn you into a capitalist to see the deposits she was making. And again, there's a news blackout all around the country except for the San Francisco people. So those of you that live in the Bay Area, in the immediate section around here, will have to bear with me while I repeat this article on the tape, because the other people don't have it, and I'm not getting it from any other paper or clippings around the country. So we have to share it with them, even though you may have the Sunday Examiner and Chronicle, January the 7th, 1979. It's called The People's Temple, $26 million Financial Empire. New York Times had a little bitty article on about page 17 or 18 on this. Nothing at all, really. And that's why I want to just give you a little resume of this article. It said that while Jim Jones preached socialism, and of course we know it was a kind of socialism he picked up in Brazil in 62 and 63, he had an empire worth $26 million with techniques ranging from selling his own hair to milking the life savings and property of people. The temple, People's Temple, has 3 numbered Swiss bank accounts in Panama worth more than $12 million, and accounts in 10 other countries worth an additional $5 million plus. There is 3 bank accounts in Zurich, Switzerland, the Union Bank of Switzerland, 3 different accounts, Paris, France, and unknown deposits. Mark Lane was just recently over in Paris. Nassau in the Bahamas, which you know is a great socialist, communist country, the Bank of Nova Scotia there, the tremendous fortune. Curacao, an account under the name of Jim Jones and Carolyn Jones. Virgin Islands, Grenada, small island out near Trinidad. Port of Spain, Trinidad, account at the Barclays Bank. That's interesting because Lieutenant Governor Dymally comes from Trinidad, who's been a staunch defender of Jim Jones. I believe he even went down to see the People's Temple. Money in Georgetown, Guyana, Caracas, Venezuela, $2 million in Venezuela. Panama City, Swiss Bank Corporation, 3 bank accounts. A Union Bank of Switzerland, and 2 in the Union Bank of Switzerland, and another one in Panama. The Bank of America, which is a great socialist bank, Fillmore Street in San Francisco. The United California Bank, another communist bank, and Montgomery Street in San Francisco, and another Bank of Montreal. Los Angeles, the Bank of America, another socialist account that Jim Jones had. This article tells how they invested $5 million down in Guyana. Boy, that settlement sure didn't look like $5 million to me. The view of the dining hall and the slave room where a bunch of old black zombies were kept packed 40 to a little shed and drugged out of their eyes, just sleeping and eating bowls of rice. $5 million investment down at that camp. It tells of how he developed power and money. And a man named Richard Cordell, who was an assistant minister, was with him for 20 years, and he's filed a lawsuit against the church. 20 years means 1958, before he went to Brazil, that Jim Jones was doing all the shenanigans. And, of course, they try to tell you that he started his fortune by selling monkeys in Indiana. I just wonder, it'd be interesting to know just how many people in Indiana have monkeys or bought monkeys from Jim Jones. I'll bet you that there are 100 people that bought monkeys from Jim Jones in Indiana when he started to build his fortune. It said he became a multimillionaire by the time he immigrated to California in 1969. A multimillionaire. Just take a little time off from Indiana, go down to Brazil, and come back a multimillionaire. He had property in Mendocino worth $11 million by 1974. By 1977, the temple went international with banks around the globe. Funds in San Francisco moved out to Barclay Bank, down to Guyana, Georgetown, and the upper echelon temple members, I'm reading from the Examiner here, opened bank accounts in their own names and foreign accounts. Paris, Caracas, Zurich, Panama City, Georgetown, and so forth. And the Blakey girl, that's Mr. Layton's daughter, said she traveled from country to country with Terri Buford on mysterious financial missions. They went to Panama and they went to London, where they spent 2 days doing research into banking. And then they flew to France and Switzerland. According to Miss Blakey, Debbie Blakey, they flew into Switzerland one night late so their passports wouldn't be stamped, and spent the night at a convent. Does the convent belong to the Pope Montini or the new Pope John Paul II? Where were the Catholic connections or the Vatican connections or the Mafia connections to the convent that these two chicks stayed in? Is it true that when you go from one country to another, if you go late at night, you can get through customs without seeing anybody? I mean, this just has to be so much BS that they can go late at night, avoid customs, go to a library in London and find out where to plunk their money down. This is part of the San Francisco Examiner Chronicle story about the funds and how they invested their money. They took this money overseas, millions of dollars, where it would pay 10% interest. A $1 million account in the Bank of Nova Scotia was closed out here. It says in San Francisco, but they used names, dummy corporations such as the Bridget, S.A., the Angelique. They used accounts, the names of Terri Buford, Carolyn Layton, and Marie Katsaris. Now, I think that's interesting because Debbie Layton's father is the one I told you, the family that have been in charge of the chemical warfare at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Utah, chief of biological research. Katsaris' girl's father is a pastor in the Greek Orthodox Church that has been a conduit of CIA funds, and Terri Buford is the daughter of a Navy captain, an officer, and a Navy brat. So you have the Greek Orthodox Church, the Navy, and Army intelligence all bunched in there, and their three daughters, young daughters, Maria, Terri, and Carolyn, are making these various deposits around. They do more on another tape on some of these investments. They also told people coming down to the Promised Land they could bring with them tape decks and radios when they left for Guyana, and as soon as they arrived in Guyana, those were taken from them and sold on the black market. But I can't believe that the property they sold, and it's listed in this Examiner article, accumulated to $26 million. I believe more that Permindex and the assassination teams and the Hughes Medical Institute or the Defense Department agencies were funding drugs and weapons and doing these mind control experiments on assassination teams, and that this money was put into these banks for them. And I don't believe that this money just came from selling stuffed animals and houses. The poverty level of some of these black people was so low and their paychecks were so meager. I don't believe Jim Jones could accumulate a $26 million fortune. No way. Certainly not millions of dollars from when he left Brazil and went back to Indiana and then to Ukiah. Tape just goes too fast. There's too much material to give out in 1 hour, but that's it, so we have to close for this week. This is Mae Brussell and Carmel. Have a good one. We'll see you next week.